Welcome to CodeJumper. This is about loops and sequences. It's lesson 7. The lesson objectives are that students will be able to understand the computer programming concepts of loops and sequences, and they'll be able to develop a program that includes loops and sequences. The outcomes are that all students will be able to identify loops and sequences in existing programs. Most students will be able to recreate a program that requires a loop and a sequence, and some students will be able to create an original program that uses loops and sequences. Key vocabulary: the word loop, a way to organize commands in a computer program so that they repeat a sequence of instructions a required number of times. In the case of the CodeJumper loop pod, the loop will continue to repeat the sequence a set number of times. The word repetition means repeating a set of commands in a computer program using a loop. And sequence, where one action is followed by another action. This first section of the Unplugged activity is to introduce students the idea of how loops and individual sequences can be combined in order to complete a task. In the last lesson, we talked more specifically about how a loop works. In this series, it's going to be more about how loops can be combined and coordinated with other sequences. The materials needed for this are the loops and sequences cards at the end of the lesson. Hand each group one of the loops and sequences cards. On the screen right now are some examples. Loops and sequences card number 1 is jumping rope. Number 2 is handing out papers. Number 3 is setting a table, sharpening pencils, brushing teeth, eating popcorn, picking blueberries, and so on, even shooting a basketball. These are all examples. Each one is written on a different card. They're all examples of things that have repetition in them. And students will need to get in their group and discuss which part of this activity is repetitious and what comes right before it, or maybe even right after it, so that they're identifying the parts that are a loop and they're identifying pieces of the sequence. Let me show you an example. Loops and sequences card number 3 is setting a table. So here's an example of what students might come up with. Number 1, clear off the table. Number 2, lay out the placemats. Number 3, get out the silverware from the drawer. Number 4, place a fork on the left side of each placemat. Number 5, place a knife on the right side of each placemat. Number 6, place a spoon on the right side of the knife. Number 7, place a napkin under each fork. And number 8, place a glass of water above the knife and the spoon. Now, in these 8 steps, some of them are going to be repeated depending on the number of people sitting at the table that are going to eat, or the number of places that you're trying to set. Once students come up with these steps, they can then go back and try to identify which of these steps is going to be repeated. So I would imagine you're only going to get the silverware out from the drawer once, because it just would be annoying to have to walk to the silverware drawer every single time you're setting a new place, especially if you're setting 8 places. That means 8 trips to the drawer. We could probably skip that and get all of it out at once. But you are going to need to repeat the fork on the left side of each placemat for every single person sitting there. So that one, and number 5, which is place a knife on the right side of the placemat, and so forth. For each place setting, those individual instructions for the place settings will need to be repeated. Have students share their example out loud with the rest of the class so that the class gets a lot of examples of sequence, what comes right before or right after something that repeats itself a lot. In the guided activity, students will identify a series of commands that repeat and then combine them into loops. They'll identify commands that occur only once in a sequence, and they'll be introduced to this idea of combining loops and single sequences in a program. And of course, they'll practice reading the code. Materials needed will be the CodeJumper kit. You'll need a hub, play, and loop pods. And then there are some code cards. There are 3 different code cards. the Loops and Sequence Melody Code Card with Loop Piano Sound Set in the MIDI Instruments Sound category. They'll need the Loops and Sequence Melody Code Card without groups and the Loops and Sequence Melody Code Card with groups. All of these are included at the bottom of the lesson. Before they begin working and creating something in CodeJumper with this code card, we want them to first read the code and identify where loops could be present. So up on the screen right now for this guided activity is the Loops and Sequences Melody Code Card without groups, meaning this is just a bunch of lines of code and they're not divided up into places that make sense to do a loop. So it says thread 1 piano, play C5 for half a beat, play E5 for half a beat, play D5 for half a beat, play C5 for half a beat, play E5 for half a beat, play D5 for half a beat, and so on. And students, as they read down this, they'll start to notice places where it makes sense that a pattern repeats. It's not going to be consistent. All of it is not repeating. There's things that come before or after that are repetitious. This will save the number of play pods needed if they can lump them together in a loop pod. So you're going to distribute this code card, the Loops and Sequence Melody Code Card without groups, to students. It is basically a list of all of the lines of code as if you were not using any loop pods at all. Have students look at it to see if they can identify where there might be loops. Walk students through this next part slowly. Up on the screen, I have an image of the hub on the left with one play pod attached in thread 1. And on the right-hand side, there's an image of a program from CodeJumper, the CodeJumper app. The lines of code say, play C5 for 1 beat, then play E5 for 1 beat. We're going to help students make sure they can replicate this code card. So to start, just have students plug in one play pod and make sure they've found the correct sound set called piano. Unlike other sound sets, students may not be able to immediately identify the C5 or E5 sounds because CodeJumper only plays that note. It doesn't actually say C5, it plays a C note. The only way to check that it is the correct note is to read the code aloud. Unless, of course, you have some musical students who are able to identify notes on their own, in which case this might be a little easier for them. After they find C5, let them add one more play pod to the first one in the thread 1 and try to find E5 next. Students will just add another play pod for the next sound and so forth as they try to replicate the code card. So then in their code card that they've been given about the melody, students will listen for and then start to identify in the code card where things repeat. So in this example, on the left is the code card without any groups identified. And on the right is an example of a student that has tried to identify where the lines repeat. The student has taken a red pen and circled the first 3 lines that it says play C5 for half a beat, play E5 for half a beat, and play D5 for half a beat. And then they have a 1 off to the left of that. Then they've circled the next set of 3 lines, which is C, E, and D again. And then the next set, which is C, E, D again. But the last the last 4 lines do not follow that same pattern. So there's 3 repetitions in this example. And students should be able to either circle or maybe put a wax sticker if they're using Braille, some indicators so that you know they're making the connection between the name, C5, E5, D5, and the note that they're hearing, and they can identify that that is where the repetition is happening. Then students will go ahead and utilize their loop pods and their play pods to recreate this program. They might need a reminder about how the loop pod works. a reminder about what comes before or after the sequence in the loop pod. The notch opposite of the short chord is what continues on after the loop is finished. And students might need a little bit of assistance just making sure they remember how it's supposed to work. It works in a clockwise direction, tracing the code and trying to identify. They're going to have to read the code aloud frequently if they're not exactly sure what notes it's playing. So just giving them a chance to sort of play around with that. And then the exploration activity, after they've figured all of that out, the objective of the exploration activity is that students will listen to the song Row Your Boat, row, row, row your boat, and then they're going to recreate it using loops and sequences. And the materials do include a loops and sequences exploration Row Your Boat code card that you can hand students. Or if students know the song already, you might let them just explore, change the sound set to Row Your Boat, and see if they can figure out where the loop is going to come into play. See if they can figure out where the loop pod comes in the line of code or in the program. The code card can be used as a check just to make sure that they've got it right. But this is a great opportunity to help identify for you which students are sort of understanding this concept of a loop and which students can actually apply it to another scenario without as much guidance from you. And that is it about loops and sequences.